This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rappin, and with me this week is one person, because we're doing a special little minisode this week, Nick White.
Hey.
Nick, I'm so glad that you're on the show. I'm so glad that we're doing this little minisode. I know that with Passover and Easter this weekend, we had some scheduling conflicts, but this week we're here to talk about one specific comic, because this is a fun minisode. We're talking about Ice Cream Man, Volume 1. I know you and I went back and forth on a bunch of books that we could talk about for this minisode, but we settled on Ice Cream Man. What are your thoughts on this? Let's just dive right into it. Full spoilers for Ice Cream Man Volume 1. That's issues 1 through 4. What's going on, Nick?
So this book has been kicked around on a couple best of lists here and there, and I know a couple listeners of the show have plugged it on occasion, and so naturally hearing all of that, made me go, well gosh, I've got to make sure I never ever touch this book, because that's just my mentality of if you make recommendations, I'm only going to bury it only further. But that being said, still there was so much talk about it, and so many comparisons to Twilight Zone, Gideon Falls, things along those lines, Twin Peaks. So I said, okay, this looks kind of interesting. I'm familiar with Martín Morazzo, who did the art. He did the art for Snowfall, and I thought that was kind of interesting. Yeah. And so I said, okay, let's give this a try. And despite not really knowing much about W. Maxwell Prince, I said let's just give this a go, and I was morbidly surprised.
Yeah, I mean, W. Maxwell Prince did a book that I deeply loved a short while back. This is in 2016. is a small little one-off book from Image called 1 Week in the Library, and that book just floored me because it was such an interesting little it was just a weird little story about the magics that exist inside of this library in this story. And I don't know what it was. I was super drawn in, and to see him on this Ice Cream Man book, it made me pick up number 1, and I read it. I was really creeped out, and I was like, I'm going to wait for the trade on this one, and I did, and honestly, I think it paid off. This first volume was super killer, and again, I also read Snowfall, and that kind of drew me in. This is a really interesting team of folks that are kind of on the periphery of comics, I think, in some ways, because I haven't seen a lot of their work, but I know that the stuff that I had read from them was really good. So coming into this book, I had a little bit higher expectations, and all in all, I want to say that it paid off, because holy crap, this was the craziest little 4-issue series that I've read. I mean, that's not the whole series, but 4-issue volume that I've read in a little while, because I'm not really a big fan of horror. I think we've talked about that many times on the show, but this book really did a good job of creeping me the hell out without going too far with all the kind of stuff that you would expect from a series that's in the horror or thriller or creepy genre, whatever you want to call that, right? I mean, I don't know what your thoughts were, but I felt like every issue was there was a good Shudder moment for me.
Yeah, no, it sort of avoids a lot of the cliches and the sort of obligatory checklist that tends to be part and parcel with horror and the horror genre. And that's not to say that other people haven't found ways of subverting that and ways of sort of breaking through all of those cliches, but I think that this is just another perfect example of something that's sort of unnerving and weird, and it's more weird than it is scary, I would say.
Yeah.
And also to your earlier point, I would say that this is one of those few books that I think really you could read it month to month, and for the most part, you really wouldn't be lost. And I think that is the sort of thing that's missing in comics these days.
Sure.
That's not to say, serialization is bad, but sometimes it's nice to break away from that, I guess. So,
well, I mean, compared to bigger stories, like if you look at an East of West, right? Let's talk about the biggest perpetrator of this problem that I think you're pointing out. A story that is so heavy with the narrative that if you missed a month or you took too long between reading issues, or even just reading trade to trade, there's so much story that you kind of have to keep track in your head that it becomes overwhelming. And that's where binging books like that really, really works. That's why you've got your CUs, or you go and you get an Image sale, or you pick up all the trades at your Barnes & Noble or your comic shop, and you just binge the series. Whereas with Ice Cream Man, this feels like an anthology that has a higher level narrative, but honestly, you could read any of the issues one-off, and I don't think you'd be lost. I think it doesn't matter what order you read the issues, you honestly could still get a really good story out of it, and none of it would fall out of place. And I think there's a little bit of like, this issue comes after that issue. Like, obviously it's serialized for a reason, but I was thinking, like, when I was writing my notes for this was, what if I read these issues out of order? What if someone gave them to me blindly and just said, no numbers, just read the issue? Would I still get the same feeling? Would I still feel like I understood the same story? Even with issue number 4 kind of starting down the track of a more narrative, like, story, like a higher, more involved part of the narrative, I still think with the one-off nature of this series, each issue is its own self-contained little, like you said, Twilight Zone kind of thing, where you've just got this weird thing that's happening in this singular town. And I mean, I don't even want to get started on that, because I have so much to say about how much I enjoyed the idea of all these weird things happening in this not so weird town. I thought that was like one of the smartest points of this, but again, to the point that I was originally talking about, I think reading this book and not having to follow it so closely, like, you don't feel lost every month. Like, each issue would easily feel like you didn't miss out on anything. You didn't really need to remember anything, like, other than the Ice Cream Man, right? He's the consistency throughout the whole series. And I mean, where do you want to go with this, Nick? Because I've got a million points that I want to make, but I'll shut up now so you can talk a little bit.
Sure. Well, to just sort of hop on the coattails of your last comment, I do think it is really great that, and this is such a rare situation, really, that if you truly, thoroughly enjoyed a singular issue of this, you can go give it to someone, no strings attached, and they can probably get like 90% of the same enjoyment that you got out of it. And I think that that's something that's super freaking rare in comics.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I know that, like, Maxwell's Demons over at Vault Comics, I know that was one of their big things. When we had Dennis Camp on for his interview way back, his thing was like, each issue is supposed to be standalone, but if you read them all together, you get the bigger payoff. And I think that that's pretty true about this series as well. And I almost love to just get in the head of Maxwell Prince, or W. Maxwell Prince, to ask him if that's what he was going with. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted your point.
No, that's fine. But yeah, I don't know. Do you want to sort of approach this from the overarching structure of it, or do we want to talk about the issues blow by blow, or what were you thinking would be an effective way of sort of tackling this insanity?
Let's go issue by issue, because I think that's the most straightforward way to get through this. And for those people at home that did read this volume going into this episode, I think that'd be super helpful.
Yeah. Okay. So, issue 1 does sort of lead off with Ice Cream Man himself, right? And this is sort of something I discussed before on an earlier episode. I think like last week's episode, in fact. And, you have a bunch of kids waiting in line to get ice cream. Most of them have parents with them. And we have this one kid who is by himself. Mm-hmm. And he gets ice cream and he begins to walk home. And as I said last time, maybe especially in this helicopter parenting, potentially over-parenting generation, we start to notice all of these different signs that were like, well, maybe in the 70s this would be okay, but like, in the 2000 whatevers now, geez, it's getting kind of dark. Like, isn't there supposed to be like an adult around? He's going into a house where the lights aren't on, the mail's piled up, nobody seems to be home.
Well, I mean, you should say, like, things are definitely, they seem innocuous. Like, they don't seem too bad until he starts to walk through his house.
Right.
Then it gets a bit weird. And I mean, kids that have pet spiders, I mean, I guess there's nothing wrong with that. Except for that just really creeps me out, because this kid seems very young to have a tarantula-esque pet spider. And I mean, the thing you didn't point out is that as this kid is walking home after getting his ice cream, there's like this narration kind of going on about
it's very like
spiders.
David Attenborough, like Blue Planet sort of,
Exactly.
Narration about spiders, which, like, I think they keep referring to it as a spider, but that motherfucker's got to be a tarantula, right? Like,
so it's something like that. I don't think like tarantulas are a specific species, but it's like one of those bigger spiders that you only hope you only see on a screen or from a very far distance in a zoo. Like, it's not a spider that you want to hang out with, as far as I'm concerned. I mean, most spiders, people don't really want to hang out with spiders.
Is well versed in like arachnid taxonomy or whatever it's called. Apologies, but so yeah,
Spider
you have
experts
this
out there,
story,
get
and
back
it just
to us.
gets more and more unnerving, and then he finally goes into the kitchen, and we find both of his parents, very much dead. Yeah.
And this is where the horror element started. Like, I think the thing that I appreciate the most about this volume was that it could have leaned really heavily into like some of the more gorier and nastier stuff that usually accompanies stories like this. And I didn't feel like there was any moment where the imagery was what was weirding me out. I think it was always the scenario which was weirding me out. And the kid plays it off like he doesn't notice that anything's going wrong.
Like, gee, mom and dad, like, you really need to go shopping. Like, I'm down to going out and getting ice cream and things like that. And it's simultaneously like, wow, that's fucked up. And, well, that's also kind of morbidly funny. And I think that makes it even more bizarre. And like, for me, it set off this really, like, internal debate for the rest of the issue of like, either one, this kid is like really dumb and maybe doesn't know how to fully take care of himself and hasn't really put everything together, or he's in denial, or like how much of this is maliciously done by this kid, right? Mm-hmm. So like, because we've all seen the narrative horror trope of like the evil little 7-year-old who is channeling Satan on the down low and, kills mom and dad to bring back the Dark Overlord 666, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So,
well, and this book doesn't really traverse into that territory because we cut from this scene to two detectives who are discussing, they're talking to an old woman who has a cat skeleton in her purse that we find out some monster has sucked the skin and all of the organs off of this cat, and she's like, so it's out in the forest. I mean, I don't know, there's a lot of just really fun little weird things that are happening which remind me of almost like, I want to say Twin Peaks, but not really, because Twin Peaks is a whole different level of weird and terrifying, I guess. But we find out that these detectives, they're looking into or they get assigned to look into these two missing folks who happen to be the parents of this kid, Mr. and Mrs. McAllister, which I'm guessing is a subtle reference to Home Alone, or I just assume McAllister is just the name that they went with. But I thought that was kind of a funny little thing. So as they're going to look into this, they find the spider, they find the kid. I realize I'm like flying through this episode, but we don't need to go through the beat by beat, panel by panel of this.
Yeah. Although I would say one of the more interesting or morbid points is that we do encounter the ice cream man again in the woods, and all of his clothes are really torn up, and he also magically summons ice cream out of nowhere to give to this kid. So it's like, what sort of weird fucking powers do we have? But also, I think, God, I want to say later in the issue, they all but confirm that he's the one who ate the cat, right? It's not initially when the boy finds him in the woods, but it's later.
Right, and so later in the issue, we do find this monster of some kind. It looks like a werewolf, looks like a Bigfoot. It's got a lot of weird, crazy teeth.
It looks like a low-rent werewolf is what it looks like.
Yeah. And the werewolf thing, it gets bit by the kid's spider, like, a lot of moving parts happening in this issue, and then it just ends, and not in like in a bad way, but it keeps this idea of wanting more. Like, the cliffhanger is very interesting in that they're playing out this idea that there is so much more to this little village or city or whatever to discover, which drove me right into following into issue 2. Like, I can't believe you stopped at issue 1 knowing that you had the rest of the issues at hand, because when I read it, I was like, oh shit, what the fuck is going on here?
Yeah, you're like, okay, so at the end you sort of understand that maybe more of these issues are going to be this intersection of multiple narratives, but also you're left with this just concerning idea about the ice cream man of like, what are you? Like, what?
Right, and really we don't get any answers to that. Like, the next issue doesn't even follow up on it, because the next issue if I recall correctly, is all about the two characters who like are addicted to heroin, and we're hearing this whole tragic story about this woman, how she's trying to leave. And I mean, Nick, go ahead. I know you've got more notes on it than I do.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things I noticed about this book is that at the beginning of every issue, there's sort of like a kaleidoscopic page, this graphical page. And it's always ice cream cones, but they're always surrounded by another element, which sort of tips you off on what the issue is going to be about. And so for issue 2, it's pills and syringes. So already you're like, okay, drugs.
Yeah.
And yeah, you basically have this pair of individuals who are, I think it's intimated that it's heroin, that the man is sort of suffering from heroin withdrawal, and his, I don't know if they say that it's husband and wife or girlfriend and boyfriend or whatever, but
regardless, yeah.
But she decides that she's going to go out and go get them a score, basically, and sort of get things back on track, so to speak. And it's marvelously written. You have this crazy stream of consciousness writing going on. W. Maxwell Prince does an amazing job at being able to like hone in and tap into these different voices and tones. And it's just written like with like very few capital letters, very little punctuation. And you just sort of, she just repeats over and over again, to this guy, it just breaks my heart in 3 to see you like this, but I already said that, didn't I? And she just keeps going on. And you have this terrible moment where like all of the panels in the house are just very, very desaturated grays and blues. And then you have a, quote unquote, look at this photograph moment where she picks up a picture of what the two of them used to look like. And the photo is very vibrant and all of the colors pop. And you all of a sudden realize that the two people in that picture are the two people that you've been seeing strung out on the couch with, syringes and pills on the table. And you're like, oh my God, like, this used to be them. Holy shit. Drugs not even once, bitch. And
yeah. I mean, there's something to be said there about, Ice Cream Man's colorist, Chris O'Halloran. Like, holy cow, like the dude did a very good job at making sure you felt the scene every single time. When we're in the decrepit house in issue 1, when you're in the decrepit house in issue 2, I don't know if that's a theme, but yeah. Like as soon as they start to do flashbacks, like the color work is really interesting. When we start to see, the Ice Cream Man, whenever he's on screen, seems to be colored more brightly than everything else around him, even in something as simple as sitting in his ice cream truck. And in fact, I mean, his ice cream truck is very vibrant too, because we find out that this woman, her name is Karen, when she goes out to do the bad thing to get the good thing, which is her like mantra near the end of the issue, she ends up stealing the Ice Cream Man's truck. And I mean, I'm getting a little bit ahead of where you were, but okay. That becomes a whole thing.
Yeah, it's really sad. You get to see sort of their progression, in terms of, having to score a bigger high and score another bigger high. And Martin Morazzo does such a fantastic job in a lot of these flashbacks, all of which are like done in like a very grayish, just dark gray. He does such a great job of depicting the toll that the drugs take, physically on this main two. You see the visible changes as the flashbacks go on with their hair and their skin, and just their physical appearance. And as
right.
she says,
and as they go from,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, she says, I felt so bad, but when you need a fix, you'll do anything. I swear, the worst things, including pawning a lady's oxygen tank. And you're like, oh wow, this is fucked up.
Oh yeah.
But then you bounce over to the other side of town, and you've got this couple who are sort of lamenting the restrictions or limitations of their own physical bodies too, but those restrictions are largely due to age. They're senior citizens. It's a much more bright and colorful looking environment. But this couple is also coping with the issues that accompany using drugs, except we're talking over-the-counter drugs, because the husband is I think recovering from like spine surgery, and he says, the drugs are putting me on, like I can't, I'm as high as a fucking kite, and I can't actually, try to get out and do rehab or recover because I'm on all of these drugs. And so there's some interesting parallels there, right?
Yeah, I really thought that was like a strange left turn for the story to take, right? Because we follow this narrative of Karen and Jimbo, and then we cut directly to this older couple, and I was really baffled, but I realize now that is all playing together, and that when you're thinking about the two different types of drugs, are they really that different? Clever commentary on the opioid crisis, I guess.
Right, yeah.
That I didn't pick up, I guess.
And then, of course, as you said, Karen gets the truck and ends up, flying across town like crazy, debating all of these different plans. She talks about how she might rob a bank, but she's never robbed a bank before, and maybe she'll rob an ATM, even though I don't know how you do that. And eventually, quite literally, collides with the other story, T-boning this elderly couple's car. And, I mean, it just shows you just how powerful addiction can be, that she hits them, realizes that she has more than likely killed someone, still tries to rob the surviving person before shooting that person, and then running away. And that's crazy.
And of course the final ending pages of this issue are the ice cream man finding this woman Karen, and
he's waiting for her at her house. Yes,
exactly. She gets back to the house, and he offers her, I should say, this ultimate score to basically say, this is the best thing you've ever had. It's the purest heroin you've ever had.
He says, it makes what you've been doing look like microwave dinners. Yeah, is his line. Yeah.
And of course, then we get our detectives back. We get from the previous issue, Jolly O Juan and Detective Briggs. I don't think we got a first name for him, but I say it's Jolly O. They also call her 5V because her first name has all five vowels in it. Yep. Which I was like, that's a strange thing, but okay, we'll move on because that nickname is never used again. That I could catch, or maybe I missed it and just glanced over it. But the detectives show up and they see that these two characters, Jim and Karen, they have overdosed on this heroin, and it's like a mystery. Like, where did they get it? How what's the deal? Because it seems to me that there's this implication that these characters, like Detective Juan and Detective Briggs, they're kind of the base level for the town, right? They're the people that are trying to recognize normal. Meanwhile, all these abnormal and supernatural things are happening around them, and they're trying to find logical reasons to explain them. But with a character like this ice cream man who is seemingly all powerful and is here to just screw with the city or something, I don't really know. And we don't really know. We don't discover that by the end of this volume, really. But he's here, and he's causing all this crazy stuff to happen. I mean, the little boy in the first issue having the spider, that's just happenstance, I guess. But him ignoring things, I think, is part of the ice cream man's influence, right? And we can get into more of that later. But I just thought that I liked the idea that the two detectives are kind of the baseline to understand normalcy in the city, because it seems to me that this city, it wasn't strange until the ice cream man showed up. And what that means and where that's going, we follow that a little bit more in the next two issues. But I'm really curious. We should move on. We should continue to talk about the issues. We can talk about our summarized thoughts.
I would say
later.
There's one final note at the sort of the end of issue 2 that I do find kind of curious, that shapes things, I think, as we go down the road. And that's that, one, Morazzo does such a good job of like framing the initial discovery of the ice cream man's van as if it almost sort of like appears out of nowhere in front of her. So of course I was kind of led to wonder, like, was the ice cream man totally intending on her, like basically setting her up so that she used it? And then when she comes back to the house and they're discussing her wrecking the van, ice cream man says to her, "Don't worry about it, I've got plenty," which is a very weird line to me. And it's like, really? You're just rolling around with tons of these? Or is it more like the ice cream you have and you're able to just materialize these things out of nowhere? So I found that very odd. And it just only adds to this further mystery of who he is and what he can do and what he's about. But, issue 3, the kaleidoscope effect is music notes and guitars. So you have sort of a kick off there, and you're following a 60s band called Bud Hickey and the Rockets. They look very much aesthetically and era-wise like we're dealing with like a 1960s Beatles sort of thing. I do believe he talks about...
Yeah, it's kind of like the the song that... Oh man, I'm blanking on all this stuff. From Back to the Future. It kind of reminds me of Back to the Future, right? As the character that's creating this like rockabilly style 50s, late 50s era music, and he created this one-hit wonder like Bud Hickey. We meet Bud Hickey in his adult age in the modern time where he's this old man who has lost everything, but it turns out he was a one-hit wonder, and I realized I kind of jumped on that, but I thought there was like this weird analogy to Back to the Future when I first started the issue, and it turns out I was totally wrong because the issue goes in a completely different direction that I'm not sure that I liked, but I'm not sure that I disliked. So go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I would say that this is the issue that I'm either unsure whether I liked it or not, or unsure what I was supposed to take away from it in some ways. But yeah, obviously you have this issue that's sort of an exploration of what happens like creatively when you've had this big hit, and he talks about, I think the song's called Rock and Roll All the Time, I think.
Yeah, and honestly, it works. It totally works for what that era of music was.
Right, and
I enjoyed that.
It's a huge hit. It gets translated into 15 languages. He talks about how he had to go into the studio and record learn all these different languages. I think he says, like, I had to learn Portuguese so people could sing it in Lisbon or something like that.
Yeah,
he has a massive hit, and of course, inevitably, the way that these things work, he's now older. We find out it was a one-hit wonder. He's an alcoholic. He goes to this cheap Greasy Spoon Diner every day. He lost his family, his house is shit, etc., etc., etc. And of course, he's lamenting the fact that he was never able to follow it up. And, right on cue, here comes Ice Cream Man pushing his cart into the diner where Bud presently sits, which is a real fucking alpha move, considering, like, the health inspector would be like, hey, like, you can't bring in outside food. That's naturally where my mind went.
Sure, okay. Yeah, let's get into the logistics of the FDA in this fucking small, weird, supernatural town.
And then he proceeds to, sell him ice cream in a restaurant that isn't even his own. So it's like, wow, this guy's got balls on him. So it's interesting because the guy turns to him, to Ice Cream Man, and he goes, oh, Rick, that's your name, right? And Ice Cream Man goes, well, that's one of them. And I'm like, buddy, like, try to even hide the fact that you're some evil mystical demon or whatever bullshit. He's like, not even trying. He's like, yeah, that's one of mine. The other one's Beelzebub. No. Ice Cream Man's like, man, I don't even care about hiding how much of a weird-ass freak I am. Like, it doesn't matter to me.
Right, you want some ice cream?
Yeah, here's a free ice cream. And of course, it's like the most sinister face you could have as he hands over this ice cream. And we watch Bud walk home, which has a really interesting callback. I don't know if you saw that. There's a missing cat poster on one of the... Oh,
I didn't see that. I didn't see that.
Okay, yeah. And he goes home, and he starts hearing music coming from his basement. Please note that the musical notes that you see coming from the basement, those are the original musical notes that you see coming from Ice Cream Man's truck. You see him a couple other times as well. I think they're eighth notes in red, yellow, and blue, I believe.
Yeah.
So, of course, he opens up the door, and he enters into this fucking insane epic fantasy dreamscape. Basically.
Yes. It feels like someone who lived through the 60s and 70s basically fell into a fantasy world, a la something like Die, right? Like, I don't mean to directly compare this to a book that's not even related to this, but it feels like take all the ideas that you would have about cool sci-fi as well as, overarching organizations that would come out of something of like a 50s or 60s spy novel.
Yeah,
and
it feels like David Bowie space epic narrative sort of shit, which is fitting because eventually we'll quite literally have Ziggy Stardust himself. Go ahead, Mike. Sorry.
Yeah, and we meet these characters that are representations of characters from songs. So we meet Rocky Raccoon, we meet Ziggy Stardust, we meet
Eleanor Rigby.
Eleanor Rigby, there was a small little line that she had about how Father Mackenzie had been killed in this war or whatever that they're fighting. And I was like, oh my, like it was again, and this is where I was kind of like on the like tipping point for this issue, because I was like, this is so fucking on the nose, but at the same time, it didn't feel super overplayed. It didn't feel like we spent this whole time like developing all these weird characters. They're just kind of like one-off throwaway things because they don't play into the bigger narrative. They're kind of just in jokes for people that maybe listen to music from that era.
Major Tom,
I thought that was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Major Tom. I mean, again, Bowie, the Beatles, they're all they're represented here, and it fits. Like these are massive successes from that time when, you know, Bud could have actually made something of himself. If he had been beyond the one-hit wonder, he would have been important, and he could have been among these, you know, characters. And yet he failed because he only could create the one song, and he says it in the issue. He couldn't think of something beyond rock and roll all the time. And even the follow-up, like the whole narrative kind of is based around Bud coming into this world, and he's the savior. He's the person that's going to fix everything with the second song that he's going to write. And honestly, this dude is just on like a massive head trip. Like whatever the Ice Cream Man gave him has put him out of the world. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I like that idea. And it's funny because the second like song that he follows up seems to be almost identical to rock and roll all the time.
Like, I think it's exactly the same. Like I think that's sort of one of the interesting interpretive points where it's like, what do you see happening here? And I do love the fact that they're like, well, you know, you did follow up on that song, right? And he's like, I did try to follow up on it. And they're like, yeah. He's like, it was called Rock and Roll All the Time Part 2. And I was like, oh, buddy. Buddy. Come on.
I mean, people have done that though. That's the thing.
Oh,
and
sure.
I like that. Like that, this was kind of like a slap in the face to like old music, while also celebrated in a weird way. And yeah, it was such a strange issue. And again, I was torn, I think, on this specific issue because I didn't know how like
don't
like
forget the yellow submarine that
if,
they fly around in too.
Yeah, and the big yeah.
Yeah, you have him appear in this world, and he's supposed to be this chosen one. I think they call him the hit maker, and he's supposed to use, basically it's fucking like Tenacious D or whatever at this point. It's like, use the power of rock to fight or whatever, and that's all I could think of. And so I think if you were expecting this to traverse like a normal narrative arc would be, of course he finds the power to fight, and he gets inspired, and he writes a new song, and he wakes up the next day, and he writes this song, and money, fame, and fortune come his way, and the sun sets, and everyone's happy, blah, 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 blah. But of course this is Ice Cream Man, and so I saw it as him struggling to come up with a new song, inevitably more or less just playing his old song and just never coming up with anything new. And it's, you know, Ice Cream Man, I don't know if you consider what happened to Gift. I consider it sort of Ice Cream Man fucking with him or taunting with him that, you know, this could have been you, or alternatively, you know, look at me, look how nice I am. I gave you an opportunity and you blew it. Or look at me, I gave you a brand new framework in which to view your failure.
Yeah, I took it as, you know, the end of the issue ends with this submarine up in the sky.
Right,
as if
and
it
that's
was
the
all
biggest
real.
thing. How do you read that?
And so my thought was maybe it is real. Maybe there's something beyond this mortal realm that this guy lives in. But seeing the previous two issues, like, is this all supposed to be like a Leprechaun kind of situation where you get your wish but something terrible happens? You know, I really wasn't sure what to take away from that. And I have to say that I appreciate that idea of maybe something good can happen here. You know, we haven't seen follow-up on any of the stories so far. Maybe we will see follow-up in future volumes. Maybe we'll see like the ramifications of these things in future volumes, like in the background.
Well, I think 4 hints at exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was getting to as we get into the 4th issue. You know, we open on this guy who was preparing to give a eulogy. His name is Joel, and he's talking with his wife, I'm guessing, and he's not sure about going to this thing because he hasn't spoken to the guy who had recently passed in like 2 years. So he's giving the eulogy for his friend Chris, who has passed away. And from there, the story kind of continues in this, honestly, the strangest, trippiest thing, all things considered, in the last 3 issues, the strangest issue by far in the volume.
Oh, Lord. And what's crazy is that literally most of that takes place over like 2 pages, and despite that, those 2 pages outweigh all of the fucking insane shit that's led up to it. Like, even the book, sort of tongue-in-cheek, goes, and now it's time for a, like, deeply disturbing interlude? And I'm like, ha ha ha, like, look at me, I'm I grew up in America, I'm a desensitized youth, bring your worst. And like 2 pages later, I was like, all right, not sleeping tonight, that's cool, peace out.
Yeah.
What the fuck did I just see?
We get Joel at this eulogy, like he gives the eulogy, it seems like it goes over really well, and we meet Chris's dad. So Chris was this musical genius, and he passed too early. He passed from an overdose, right? Is that what that was?
At first they made it sound like it was suicide, but I think the only other he looks young, right? Because we do see him eventually, minor spoilers. But
full spoilers. We're fully spoiling this book.
That's the joke. Obviously, the whole rest of this is spoilers. Yeah. They intimate at one point that he was sick, and neither the dad nor the friend really knew about it. And I think that's the extent to which we really know details. That's
right. Okay. That's true. Sorry. Yeah. I keep getting. I have foggy memories. These 2 guys the guy from issue 2, Jim, and Chris. I keep getting them swapped in my head. I don't know why. But Joel ends up going out with Chris's dad. They have this discussion, and it goes in a really weird direction, which I thought was an interesting way to tell this story of Joel. He's not, like, his wife is pregnant. They have a kid coming, and right, because they have a kid coming.
He's sort of struggling with the anxieties of what being a parent will be. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah, and he asks Chris's dad, who apparently ran out on Chris when he was young, why did you do that? What made you want to do that? Because you know what? I think I might want to do that. And I thought that was like totally out of left field, but like what a way to tell this story about the fear of being a parent by having 2 characters, like a soon-to-be parent and a parent who ditched his whole family and has been in and out of his kid's life to have this conversation. And Chris's dad talks about how he went out and he joined a commune and he was a hippie, and like it was all about free love, man. Another throwback to the late 60s and 70s, or early 70s. But like, yeah, things get really strange as we see just sporadically throughout the issue. We get these little boxes of red saying, "Wait, what's going on here?" And no explanation. Sorry, you just don't. You got to keep reading the story, bud. What the fuck was going on? Like, I was totally baffled as to what was happening, like flipping back and forth through pages, asking myself, like, did I miss something? Was there a panel that I just didn't read correctly? And it's like, no, dude, you just got to build up to the end of this issue where we're going to reveal everything, and it's going to be awful.
Yeah, and his dad's like, oh, I wish I could have hugged my son one last time, as they're driving from the bar, and Joel goes, hey, what if you could? And I'm like, oh, fuck no. No. I
genuinely thought we were going to get into like some weird necromancy stuff.
Dude, same.
So they end up going to the cemetery, and the body hasn't been buried yet, so they open up this kid's casket, and they pull out his dead body, and his dad hugs him, but we get this cut. I'll let you describe it, Nick.
Oh my god. Like, first off, this whole like hug moment, like honestly, W. Maxwell Prince is great at like nailing these moments that are just two-tone emotions where you're just vacillating between, oh, is this heartfelt and sentimental, or is this like fucking cute and also, I mean, not cute, but like, is it heartfelt and sentimental, or is this like fucking crazy and probably illegal?
Yeah.
Like, it's like, how am I supposed to take this? And
well, I mean, especially given Joel's face when he says that, he's like, how would you feel if you could do that one more time? Like, there was something sinister.
It's like a fucking eureka moment face, like the light bulb went on, and I'm like, no.
Yeah, it was terrifying moment. And I mean, we get these 2 pages in between. I mean, I don't know how to describe it, because we get the reveal as to what these like little red splotches or little red boxes are. Like, hey, wait, why is it changing? What's happening to me? Where am I?
Things? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Who's saying these things? And we cut to what I can only assume is Chris in this hell landscape, like this truly demented landscape where his death or torture or wherever he is happening, and it's changing and it's repeating, and he keeps getting killed or like tortured or something in all these different ways, and no explanation. This is just happening from panel to panel. And I honestly have to credit I really have to credit Martín Morazzo and Chris O'Halloran for putting these things together in simple one-page or one-panel spreads that are just, they raise so many questions, and we get no answers. Like, and there were so many things to study in those few pages and panels, like what's actually going on here. We get that common phrase that we've seen throughout the whole issue, and I haven't brought it up until now, but the Ice Cream Man's thing is, don't worry, like he'll say something, comma, lickety split. Like that's his whole thing, like 2 scoops, lickety split. And we get a panel where there's this horrible melting monster that he says this whole paragraph or a little bit of text, and his last line is lickety split. Big questions here. Big questions, because we saw this monster. In the first issue, right? We saw this werewolf monster, and that's the Ice Cream Man? Question mark. Was the Ice Cream Man just a regular dude who turned into this monster? Is there something else? Because in the first issue, the little kid who had the pet spider asks, "Hey, you're the Ice Cream Man," and the guy looks down at himself in torn clothing. He says, "I guess I am." Like, what happened? Was there some monster that just showed up? Some demon inheriting his body? Like, so many unanswered questions in this volume. I mean, we're not finished with the issue 4, but holy cow, there's so much that happens in like these 2 pages that open up 1,000 more questions in my head. Like, I needed to read volume 2, but I told myself I wouldn't spoil this episode with reading further on in the series.
Yeah, it's just crazy. Like, you find out that Chris has ended up in this locale that I think is called the Sweet Place.
Something.
I believe
I don't know.
I think that's what it's referred to, and I was like, no, this is the bad place. Oh, this is the bad place. And
yeah.
You have these panels of like him, like he's like strapped to a wheel where skeletons that are wearing the Ice Cream Man's hat are like beating him with feathers, and there's another where like a bunch of dogs are wearing like surgery scrubs, and they appear to be vivisecting Chris, and it's like, what the fuck? Like, we are in all caps town now. Like, things are crazy.
Nick's notes are just all caps from here on out, by the way.
Yeah, all of my notes just go all caps because I'm like, what is this? And so, yeah, you like it only further begs this question of like, what is the intent and what are like the limitations of the Ice Cream Man? Like, is he just human? Well, issue 1 suggests, well, no, he also can transform, and issue 3 suggests he can worm his way into people's dreams or visions, and 4 is like, he's got his own fully functioning afterlife of sorts that he controls. Like, it's like a real big question of like, what? Like, where, like, what are the solid limitations for this guy? Because with each issue, it's like, well, maybe there aren't limitations on this guy. Like, he's like, bordering on being a god,
Right. And the final pages of this volume, at least of the story, they bring in this new character. We see the Ice Cream Man in his truck, and he's sitting in just kind of being an Ice Cream Man, and a man in all black, a cowboy, if you must. He's wearing a cowboy hat, so we call him a cowboy. Yeah. He walks up, and he says to the Ice Cream Man, like, I know what you're doing to this town, and I don't like it. And
the Ice Cream Man, I imagine they wouldn't like to find out either, or something like that. Yeah.
And the Ice Cream Man looks visually, like, scared, and he calls him Caleb. He calls this character Caleb. And that's where the issue ends. Like, that's the end of the volume. Like, what the heck? Like, so many questions unanswered. Like I said, I had to resist diving into volume 2. There were so many things that I wanted to know, I wanted follow up on. And if the series continues to tell these stories in little narratives, like, as they're building a bigger plot, like, I'm totally fine with that. I love these little one-off things. These one-off stories about the strange things happening in this town totally draws me in. I love being able to just pick up an issue and not really have to worry about too much about what happened in the previous issues in order to keep reading. I mean, we kind of talked about it already, but this volume is so effective in keeping you hooked issue after issue, page after page. I was really, really impressed by it.
Yeah, 4 ends on an interesting moment where I kind of start to wonder if the book is pivoting more towards the mythology of the Ice Cream Man starting to take front and center, and I don't think that's what will happen. I think when you look at the bread and butter structure of these 4 issues, it would be pretty foolhardy to abandon that. But I do believe that there might be more of an interesting focus, or at least more of a stretched out focus on this apparently Ice Cream Man's brother, who Ice Cream Man appears to be very afraid of. Mm-hmm. And I think in kind of a way, like, Ice Cream Man's brother is supposed to be like the cool older dude, right? You know, because he's like a cowboy, and now all of a sudden,
sure,
like, this other dude is like a lame ass 1950s, looks like a, you know, knockoff Good Humor Man sort of character. And I love how you see sort of the brim of his hat cast this shadow over his eyes like a mask, and like he's just got this absolutely fucking terrified look on his face, and you're like, who is this other guy? Like, because clearly, I mean, one would assume he's pretty powerful too, or something like that.
Something like that. I mean, that's all the more reason to continue reading, right? Like, reading volume 2 is probably what I'm going to do in the next week, just because, like, that's such a cool way to end a volume.
Yeah, it's amazing. And like I said, like, I still think one of the best features of this series is that, much like Twilight Zone, all of these issues are largely they're meditations on different things, from coping with fame and failure to dealing with drug addiction.
You know, when your parents die because your pet spider got out,
and dealing with loss, and one is largely about what happens when you let your kid, when you compromise and you think you're smart by not letting your kid get a puppy, and you land on something else, which inevitably brings about your untimely demise. So, I mean, issue 1 is just really a long lesson about, you know, not compromising for shit like spiders and gerbils and pets like that, and just, you know, just go get the puppy.
Yeah, I mean, my summation thoughts, because we really are running out of tape. I told Nick we'd only record for like a half hour. We're coming close to an hour here. But, you know, the thing I really enjoyed is that this series never nails anything down about anyone or anything. Like, it really keeps everything aloof. There's no rules or limitations that we've seen so far outside of, you know, this is real life to a certain extent, except for when you're the Ice Cream Man. And, you know, every issue has been about discovering the world and the characters bit by bit. We never really see too much continuity outside of the 2 detectives, you know, Detective Juan and Detective Briggs. And even then, like, what we get to know about them is very, very little. And I'm okay with that. I think discovery in this way, and the way that this narrative is being told in like a non-linear fashion, sort of like it's telling multiple points that end up somewhere. Where those points all intersect, we're not sure, but we do know that the commonality is the character of the Ice Cream Man. I honestly, was just impressed with how, like, sucked in I got on this book. I mean, there was some hype behind it because I'd heard, you know, Brian was reading it and he told me it was really good, and Nick was talking about it last week, and I was like, yeah, let's dive into this book. But by the time I got to issue 3, there's no stopping. I'm finishing this volume in this sitting. It's that good. And I think it helps that, again, like I said before, you know, we never get into the overly gory or sexual or weird, like, super horror tropes that usually plague books like this, where you feel just grossed out by looking at it, or like the ideas in it. Nothing in this book was so overwhelming that I felt like I had to stop, or I had to, like, take a breather.
I mean, doing drugs doesn't, you know, this book still doesn't make doing drugs look appealing, let's be clear, but
yeah, I mean, and I think it approaches these horrors in a way that doesn't feel super overwhelming. Like, I think overwhelming is the key word. Yeah, gratuitous. That's the better word. I felt like I was creeped out enough that it was like, ooh, that's really weird. And then I moved on and I kept reading the book because it doesn't focus on that. It doesn't keep bringing you back to the same like gross moments if they do exist in this series.
Yeah.
I really appreciated that, and it helps that like issue 3 is kind of way out there zany after number 2 is really dark. I mean, I think that was a really smart point on there for the creators here to say we're going to do this really dark, real issue, and then the next issue is kind of going to be a little bit more out there and zany,
spacey.
That was
2 was like very much like this is the monster that is addiction, a very real topical monster, followed by this, just zany, loopy. Just escape basically, and I mean, if there was sort of a big settling final point that I would say like, wow, like my hat is completely off to this team, but especially like Martín Morazzo, because, and if we got his name right there, because like I can't even imagine what it must have been like when he's like, okay, so what do you want me to draw for this book? Like, is this like space or is this like real life? And I'm sure W. Maxwell Prince was like, well, basically it's just going to be you drawing everything, like any like this book is going to be everything.
Yeah,
like anything and everything.
A lot of opportunities. Yeah, and I think that's might have been one of the draws to work on this book, was the opportunity to draw so many very different things. Like, we're going to do monsters, we're going to do animals, we're going to do people, we're going to do space adventures.
Fantasy space epic that basically could be its own book. Yeah.
Yeah. I'd like to see follow up on that, if only just to see what other fun, goofy things they could play with in that world. But again, if they don't ever visit it, I won't feel like I lost much, because it just adds to this huge universe that W. Maxwell Prince is creating in order to tell this really creepy story about this ice cream man character.
Yeah, totally.
So, Nick, what are your final thoughts on this? You're going to keep reading the book? I think I've made it very clear that I'm going to, but I wonder, like, how do you feel about this book? Is this one that you're looking forward to check out in the future?
Yeah, I've already got volume 2, and I'm sitting on it, and I'm definitely probably going to be reading that. Definitely, probably. Nice one, Nick. I'm definitely going to be reading that real soon. Mm-hmm. I'm really interested to see where this goes, because as I said, the book doesn't as much end on a plot cliffhanger as it sort of ends on kind of like a tonal cliffhanger in terms of, like, is this book going to shift more towards this relationship between the two? Or are we being sort of teased at the end by this idea that it could get into that, but really we're just going to be slowly handed out little morsels as arc 2 goes on. We're going to slowly learn the nature of the relationship between these two, which I think is probably what we're going to get. And I am interested to see more of this subtle world building, like I said, with the missing cat poster that shows up in issue 3 that clearly is a reflection of issue 1, or the detectives that were introduced to in issue 1 that come back to the addict's house in issue 2. I'm interested to see more of that world building, and I would encourage most people that are just genuinely just interested in comics to read this. I don't think there's a big genre barrier here. I don't think there's a fear factor here or a gore factor here that I would say, to stay away from. I would argue the fact that it does tackle some pretty sensitive topics for some people. But that would be the only thing where I would say, like, at least be aware that this book does sort of handle some weighty issues, from child abandonment to addiction to everything in between.
Yeah, I totally agree there. I think, obviously after we've already spoiled the entire book, I think it's worth a read. I genuinely think it is, and I think if you're going to get into it, get volume 2. It's a seriously solid comic that I think has gone under the radar for some folks. It's an out there kind of strange comic, but man, oh man, does it pay off. I think it super works if you're looking for something that's an anthology-ish comic, right? This isn't just like completely independent. It's an anthology that builds in the same universe, and I don't know of many other comics that do that, or at least if they do it, they don't do it as well. But yeah, so I guess, Nick, I want to thank you for working with me to put this together this week. I know with our schedule snafus, we've kind of been all over the place, but we're getting there. Episode 200 is going to be massive, folks. I hope you're excited. So I Want to say, thanks, Nick, again. You can follow both of us on the internet. You can follow Nick at Death Star Plans. You can follow me at Mike Rappin, and you can follow the show at IRCB Podcast, where I post all sorts of stuff when I'm not traveling all the time. I promise the Twitter account is active, and we post some cool stuff. We follow a lot of fun people, and I try to retweet some things that need, eyes on it, because people make really cool comics out there that probably fly under your radar. So make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram, where I try to post things pretty often. You can also check out our Goodreads group at goodreads.com, where if you just search I Read Comic Books, we're pretty much the first Goodreads group. Since we're super duper active, we've got like 550 or so members. I don't know the exact number, but we do weekly threads. We do our book of the month thing that shows up here every other month, and this week we had a huge thread, Every Hero Needs a Good Villain, and people are just on there talking about heroes and villains. That's a thing. It's a big thing in comic books. You can go to ircbpodcast.com, where we have links to our merch, links to all of our zines. You can check out our pronunciation guide for when we butcher names, and then we try to fix that by giving you the English way to say someone's name, or at least the, Midwest way to say things, because that's just where a lot of us live. And yeah, it's a pretty cool website. We like it a lot.
Please rate and subscribe. Tell your friends about the show. Share the show. If you haven't rated, why not? It helps us. Go get on Stitcher. Go get on Apple Podcasts. Maybe when you give 5 stars to your Uber driver, tell him to give 5 stars to our show. See how well that goes over.
Yeah.
Please go ahead and email our show if you have comments, questions, jokes, anything in between. That's at ircb@destroythecybe.org. And we would love it if you would subscribe on Patreon. You can do that over at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. That's for exclusive audio and articles. You get access to our Discord, which is really, really been a hit with a lot of people. I'll tell you, it's going over really well. And you get access to our top of the pile posts, and so much more that we've got planned, including Mike's Doom Patrol series.
Yeah, me and Paul, this Doom Patrol series is fantastic. I love it. I'm so excited to keep reading and talking about it. Infinity Shred is the best. They are, honestly, one of the coolest bands. You can check out their music at infinityshred.com, or you can check out their music on Bandcamp. Just search for Infinity Shred. Xander is a very fun guy who also edits the show. He's a wizard and just a genuinely nice person. I want to say thanks to Nick. Thank you to all the listeners out there. And honestly, thank you to everyone who's contributed and helped our show in some way, shape, or form, sending us an email, rating us on iTunes, anything. It means so much to us that you guys do that. So until next time, comics are good, and so are you.